Check the description for the following discount codes. So here's the second review for the Aiologs products that got sent over to me. The first was their sequential shifter, which is actually sat on the floor here. If you haven't seen that video review, by all means go and watch it. Half decent little sequential shifter, if that's what you're after. Today we're looking at their handbrake, which to all intents and purposes, reuses the same housing. It's all stainless steel here, your USB ports in the same place, this little switch is in the same place. The clear top cover is the same, and again that can be swapped out for one that isn't clear. If you don't like the clear top, I personally do like the clear opening. I like to see inside and see the workings. I'm not going to strip it apart. What you will see in there is this little arm here attached to a potentiometer. So this isn't a load cell based handbrake, and that is a real shame because the build quality, the fit, the finish of everything is really nice. So you've got two different shaft lengths, again just the same as what came with the sequential shifter, and this is your handle itself. There's only just the one. The sequential shifter had a choice of two different handles you could fit at the top. Handles or knobs, gear handles, whatever you want to call them. Handbrake handle, gear knob. Yeah, it makes sense to me. And these just slide on to either your long shaft or your short shaft, depending on your preference. And they're done up with two little grub screws, one there and one there. Now they do supply all the Allen keys that you need to be able to fit everything. The smaller Allen keys, the tiniest one, actually does up this little Allen bolt there, which attaches this piece of the table clamp. That's what the very small one's for. There's then a rubber that goes over the top of that so that it's not digging into your desk, and we'll look at this in a second properly. The medium-sized Allen key, I don't think these actually say what size they are on them. No, they don't. They're probably just cheapo Allen keys. The medium one is for undoing these bolts here, or another one there, for attaching your mounting plate. And as you can see, there's many different holes in many different places, and the configurations you can use, I can show you by holding this up here. So that's the three different orientations you can use to mount this to your aluminium profile rig as the intended use with this plate. But of course it is just a plate full of holes, so ultimately any rig that has a flat surface that you can put that to, and drill a couple of holes and put a nut and bolt through would work just as well. For me, obviously, GT Amiga Prime aluminium profile, so I'll use this alongside a couple of T-nuts and bolts. So that is, oh yes, and then finally this large Allen key is for doing whichever shaft you choose up, because in the very end of that there is a hole, and that's what this goes into. You screw it in and you just nip it up, and that would screw directly into there, in case you were wondering. So yeah, inside here just a potentiometer, a couple of very hefty looking springs, and again some nice solid stainless steel and aluminium construction. I think this is pretty much all stainless, and the shaft, actually no, these are too heavy for aluminium. These must be stainless shafts as well. In fact, even this is quite a lump. Maybe everything's stainless. I don't know, who knows? But most of it's definitely stainless. I know that. So yeah, no load cell. Little bit of a disappointment there. But then if we compare this to, the price of this is $170 US, which is in UK pounds 120 quid or something, maybe. I mean, then you've got to add import duty and shipping, probably ends up about £170 as well, doesn't it? But if we compare it to something like the Husingveld Engineering handbrake, I've actually got their earlier model. That's what my daily driver handbrake is over there on the rig. They don't do that anymore. Their current offering is 286 euros, which in dollars is going to be what? $350. So what we have here is literally half the price. And for that reason, perhaps we can excuse the lack of a load cell. Although, in fairness, I'm going to say no, we probably can't excuse the lack of a load cell, because a load cell is about £7. And even if you pay full retail for a Leo Bodner controller for your load cell, I'm sure they're only about 20 notes. And obviously, if you're manufacturing these, you're probably not going to pay Leo Bodner retail prices for a load cell controller. You'll just make one yourself or get one made for you. So I think really, and even if, I mean, that is going to cost more than one potentiometer. This single potentiometer is probably £1, whereas a load cell and a controller and amplifier board, I don't know, even if it costs £10 because you're buying them in mass and you're producing products with them rather than me, buying one retail, I think whacking an extra £10 or $15 on the price to give us a load cell would definitely be the way to go. And in fact, if you've got Aiologs, if you're watching the review, which you probably will do, you should just do that. No one's gonna hesitate at paying the extra money it will cost for you to put a load cell inside this handbrake. And of course, these days, especially with everything else being, the fit and finish of everything else is just lovely. And then you see that little shiny 10K potentiometer in there. Now, for those of you that don't know the difference between potentiometers and load cells, potentiometers literally measure how far something has travelled. They're like a volume. In fact, this one's very much like a volume knob because it's a rotary potentiometer. In its fully anti-clockwise position, the resistance is nigh on 0, and its fully clockwise position, the resistance is 10,000 ohms, 10 kilo ohms, and that just varies. The voltage that's coming in alters it, and whatever comes out the other end is mapped to a position in the game. So you could remove the springs out of here, and this could be really floppy and have no resistance at all, and you could still put it in exactly the same positions as you would if it had springs, and in your sim, in your game, it would register the same input. A load cell, on the other hand, is a pressure sensing device, a bit like what you might find in bathroom scales. They often have 4, one in each corner, and whilst they do move, they don't move like a potentiometer, varying voltage by rotating or sliding. They kind of distort. So it's more of a very fractional distortion of the material, or a very slight bend. And that's how it measures the pressure that's being applied. It's almost imperceivable to the human eye, the amount it actually moves. They're very, very accurate if you get good ones. So yeah, it's not the same as a potentiometer, turning 180 degrees or 360 degrees of rotation. A load cell deflects or distorts ever so slightly, almost on like an atomic level. That not something you really see happen for the most part, and that generally is the sensor of choice for things that want to measure weight or pressure, force, ultimately, and that's what is kind of standard in a lot of sim racing brake pedals and the Huizenveld handbrake that I've got over there. Now this is screwed in, so let's just see how it feels on the desk. Okay, I was trying to push it forward. It doesn't go forward, it just goes backwards. So let me just tilt the camera down a bit actually. With a longer shaft on, you're going to get mechanical leverage, which is going to assist the force you apply at the top. So this requires very little effort whatsoever. And this is what I don't like about potentiometers. Not the force issue. If I want to have 100% handbrake engagement, I have to pull it from its stationary position to the end of its travel. Rather than if this was a load cell handbrake and you adjust the tension or the preload, it may only move a fraction like that. But you apply a certain amount of force, and you can vary that force quite accurately once you get some muscle memory, instead of having to travel all this distance. Now you could short calibrate this, and what I mean by that is calibrate it so that only 50% of the travel hits 100% handbrake engagement in game. You could do that, but you're inevitably going to end up going beyond that, and it's just not going to be very accurate. Now, we could go into the debate here, because someone in the comments will go, but you only ever need 100% on your handbrake, Carl. You know, you operate them in an on and off fashion. Well, you don't operate handbrakes in an on and off fashion. You will vary the amount of force applied to that handbrake depending on the road surface you're on. Tarmac, for example, on a hot, sticky summer's day will require more braking force to lock up the rear wheels and make them initiate a slide versus being on loose gravel or ice or even a wet road. And if you were to apply 100% handbrake on ice, for example, you'll find you'll over rotate your car, you know, talking from like a rally type scenario. So you don't really want it in an on and off fashion. You do want to be able to vary the pressure. And one thing I like about my HE one is I've got that muscle memory now of just how hard to pull it to get the right amount of wheel lockup that I need depending on the surface that I'm on. Now, you can do that with this. It's just, it won't be about pressure. It'll be about exactly where in its travel you pull it to. And because it's actually quite easy to pull at the moment with this longer handle on, that wouldn't be the easiest. Now, we can take this longer one off and put the shorter one on, and that is, of course, going to give us greater resistance, because as I started to say a second ago, leverage comes into play here. Longer the shaft, the easier it will be for you to pull it. So if we put this short shaft on and let this slide all the way down as low as it will go, so we've got the least amount of leverage possible, this is going to be much, much harder for me to pull. In fact, it almost looks a little bit weird. In fact, I don't really like. Oh no, even then it's not that. No, this needs to be stronger, these springs, in my opinion. I mean, I haven't tried it on my rig yet, but I think it's a bit too easy. I mean, this is definitely better than with the longer one on, but it's still not as stiff as I would like. And depending how you have this on your rig, I think your hand maybe a little close to this edge here, but perhaps not, because you'd have to actually be at quite an angle to catch that. But we'll get it installed on my rig up. The problem is to have this, I like a handbrake at sort of shoulder height, almost, a bit like you would in a real rally car, rather than down low. So that's going to have to sit, ideally, out in front of me, somewhere on there. I don't know if I'm going to have somewhere to put it to. I may have to use the longer shaft, which again to me is going to look more like a real hydraulic handbrake. And fix it in the same way that I did the sequential shifter, which means it is going to be a bit easier to pull. But we'll get it all installed and we'll see. Speaking of on-off nature of handbrakes, some people say they use them like that. This little switch here on the opposite edge to the USB port actually switches between analog handbrake and on-off mode, as in it's fully on or it's fully off. Probably for games that don't support an analog handbrake, perhaps some of your Need for Speed titles or something like that. Now, there's no micro switches in here, so it doesn't actually know, there is no physical on-off measurement. It must just be altering something in software to report the resistance from the potentiometer, the voltage coming out after the resistance changes, beyond certain thresholds to register on or off. So let's say 5 volts goes in, for example, because it's USB, so it probably is. In fact, it definitely is. It might be that below 2.5 volts of, you know, movement and resistance, it then registers a pull, and then when you release it and it goes back above 2.5 volts, it registers an off signal. That would be my guess as to how it does that. And what that also means is you're going to have free play before it actually reaches, say, the 2.5 volt threshold, if that's how it works. You know, it could be they choose a 4 volt threshold, in which case you haven't got to move it very far at all before it registers an engagement. If, of course, it is a 0 to 5 volt swing, and if 0 volts is the middle position, if 5 volts is the middle position and 0 volts is the fully applied position where the resistance is at its greatest. Obviously, I'm guessing. I didn't make this, but it would work something along those lines anyway. But that's what that little switch there is for. It flicks between the two. I'll plug it. In fact, let's plug it in to this PC here, and just see whether Windows goes from seeing it as an analog device to seeing it as a digital input. I mean, it must do, really. Otherwise, the games that you're trying to use it on wouldn't see it either. Now, oh yeah, that's a good point actually. Someone said to me in the other review, Carl, you forgot to mention the little LED that's inside. There is an LED inside there. It's RGB and you can choose what colour you want. The reason I forgot about it is because when I had it mounted on my rig, I couldn't see it because the shaft and the gear knob just literally completely obscured my view of it, and this pretty much does the same. But you can just about make it out inside there, perhaps. I don't know, my studio light might be washing it out, but you see a little bit of it coming through there. But yes, there is an RGB LED. You can choose what colour you want. So let's just have a goosey in my USB game controllers control panel. We are seeing an Aiologs Handbrake, and yeah. So it shows up analog axis and one button is showing up. So let's press the little button on here. Oh, and now the single button, button 1, is now registering, and it's registering about, you only have to move it maybe 25% of its travel, and then the rest of the travel does nothing. So you move it from here to about there, and it registers, that tiny little bit of movement there. So then the rest of this travel, this does nothing, it's still on. So yes, that's what that little button does, and that's how it works. It's interesting because it's showing both the analog input and the digital input on the screen at the same time. I guess whatever little board they've got in here reports both, and that button on the back just flicks between one and the other. So that's how that works. Just curious to see. And also now we know how far to move this to get it to engage. Really not that far. Let's have a quick look before I put it on the rig and try it out at the cable table clamp, in actual fact, Carl, not whatever I just said. This comes all assembled apart from this, which you have to screw in and then put the little piece on the top there, like I showed you with that Allen bolt a minute ago. And it slots into these two big slots here, like this. And you then get the two bolts, one of which I showed you earlier. And they go in this hole here, and we just do them up. Now, I tested the table clamp for the sequential shifter, and that worked just fine, and it is exactly the same as this. So I'm not expecting any surprises here, but I shall clamp it to the table and give you a little demo just in case you are a desk mounted sim racer. I mean, typically people wanting to buy handbrakes are going to be rally sim fans or drifting sim fans, I would imagine, a bit like myself. There's also these two little rubber pieces of trim that go along here to sit on your desk. So again, a bit like the rubber cap there, it's to stop you mashing up your desk with the hard edge of stainless steel. So that's a nice little touch as well. And they literally just push on like that. One there, right at the back. So I'll just tilt the camera down and show you it clamped on the desk. There it is. Just do up the clamp. And this desk is just an old desk I've had kicking about for years. I think it was actually my sister's when she was about 10 years old and we lived at home with her parents. My sister's 4 years younger than me, so it's a very old desk. But there we go, it's clamped on, and I mean my desk is going to wobble, but it works, just fine. If you want to have this on a desk, you definitely can. I mean, you'll see the camera shaking there because that's sat on the desk as well. But the clamp itself works just fine. So we've got no complaints there. Just like we did with the sequential shifter version as well. So everything's really easy to install. Table clamp's easy to install, it's easy to change your shaft and your handle over. It's easy to flick between analog and digital mode. And obviously you've got your mounting plate, which can be attached in the 3 different ways I showed you in the manual. So what I'm going to do now, go bosh this on my rig, give it a little try out in Dirt Rally, and then I'll report back my findings and what I think of it. Bearing in mind the price point, it's a lot cheaper than say the Huizenveld offering. So we can't expect the same performance as what I get out of my one, but useful to have that one as a benchmark. Well then, what do I think of the Aiologs Handbrake, Analogue Handbrake? It's this is a tricky one because I'm so used to using that HE handbrake that my first impression when I got it on the rig and I sat there at the start of a Dirt Rally stage and pulled it was that it felt very light and very flimsy by comparison. And that feeling carried on throughout the stages that I was repeating. And I chose some stages with lots of hairpins. I'll put some footage up with me now going around a few. I felt like I had to be delicate with it and not pull too hard. Now that probably isn't the case because it's really well built and I don't think I would damage anything by pulling it too hard. But because there wasn't much resistance, it felt like I had to be delicate with it. And I really didn't like that. So this definitely can't be compared to the likes of the HE handbrake, but then it is half the price. So it isn't a fair comparison anyway, and we need to bear that in mind. It is half the price. Now, what would we be comparing it to? We'd be comparing it to things, I guess, like the Fanatic handbrake. I mean, that's flimsy. I'm not a fan of that either. That's not a good handbrake. The Thrustmaster offering is, again, not the best. I mean, that sort of price point, you know, 200 odd dollars, give or take, and you know the same in pounds and euros depending where you are in the world. This comes in at 170 plus shipping. This is probably the better built of the bunch. As I say, I say build quality wise, it is a better built of the bunch. I don't like the potentiometer, and like I said earlier in the review, for the sake of 10 quid's worth of parts, or even if they had to pay full retail, it's 25 pounds worth of parts. Put a load cell in there, stick it on the price. This is an all stainless steel construction, you know, piece of equipment, and it looks lovely and it feels lovely, and it's got a potentiometer which lets it down. Also, again, just like with their sequential shifter, when you use this longer shaft, the resistance is very, very little. You know, there's not anything that can easily be done about that because it's simple, you know, leverage and forces when you put a longer shaft on, like trying to undo a wheel nut, you know, with a 2-inch bar versus your 3-foot snap-on breaker bar. You know which one's going to get the job done a lot easier. And that's what we're doing here by putting this longer shaft on. But I think perhaps for the handbrake particularly, where most people are probably going to have it with a longer shaft, they should install stronger springs, or you know, perhaps make some way of being able to swap them out easily. I mean, it means taking the whole thing apart. They'd have to redesign the way it all works. So I guess that just isn't really possible. You know, either having to redesign the way it works, so you've got a tension adjustment, or being able to swap springs out means it, you know, it's no longer what it is here. And what they've done here is utilize, you know, one design to make 2 different products. This is obviously the sequential shifter. You know, if we look inside the way the spring mechanisms are and the construction, everything, it's all exactly the same, which is great from a production point of view and keeping costs down. But in this case, I think you can get away with it being not quite so strong, the springs on a sequential shifter, because you're just back and forward. I'd still prefer it to be stiffer, but you know, it's personal preference in a lot of these instances. But I think for the handbrake, which is something, if you've ever done any drifting in real life or even just handbrake turns, you know, particularly with a hydraulic handbrake, you apply quite a lot of force on that handbrake. Now again, that will vary, because if you've got a long handbrake, you're not going to need to put on as much force, you know, like a big tall wand, you're not going to have to put as much force on as if you just fitted a hydraulic master cylinder to like a factory fitted handbrake that's down beside your seat, which you can do. That would require a lot more force than pulling on the tall wand. And in some respects, those tool wand hydraulic handbrakes that we would fit to drift cars, it intentionally makes it easier to lock up the rear wheels. You don't have to pull as hard as you would using a shorter handbrake that's mounted down between your seats. So you could look at it that way, but I guess for me personally, again, it's personal preference, I'm used to pulling quite hard on my handbrake in dirt rally, and I can vary the amount of pressure, the amount of wheel lock, or how early the wheels lock, depending on the surface, and I'm used to that. Could you get used to it with this? Yes, of course you can, because you can get used to anything with enough practice. I just prefer having to pull harder on it, perhaps so that I don't over brake on those slipperier surfaces. But anyway, I'm waffling here. This is all my personal preference. What you like will vary as well. It might not be anything like what I like. But as far as the review goes, the build quality is excellent, just like their sequential shifter. You've got your interchangeable shafts. You can flick between analog and digital mode depending on what game or sim you're using. You can change your clear top plate for one that isn't clear. You can mount it in 3 different positions, comes with a USB cable, no drivers necessary, just installs and works straight out the box. And I do like the presentation and the way it looks. The only thing I don't like, potentiometer, which measures travel versus pressure and the stiffness of the springs. But there we go. That's my review. There will be a link in the description to the Aiologs website should you want to pick one up, because for the price, it's still a decent alternative to a Thrustmaster or maybe even the Fanatic, in my opinion. Anyway, as always, thank you very much for watching and take it easy.